It was a warm, sunny afternoon, and the park was a peaceful haven for those seeking a moment of tranquility. The gentle breeze rustled through the trees, and the sounds of birds chirping added to the serenity of the scene. People sat on benches, strolling along the paths, or lounging on the grass, enjoying the beauty of the day. In the midst of this peaceful environment, an elderly woman, a colored woman in her late 60s, found a quiet spot under a large oak tree to sit and read her book. With her wide-brimmed hat shading her face, she was lost in the pages of her novel, letting the calmness of the afternoon wash over her. She had no expectations for the day other than to enjoy a peaceful escape from her daily routine. For her, afternoons like these were precious, moments of solace where she could be alone with her thoughts, far from the stresses of the world. Little did she know that this seemingly ordinary day would soon take a sharp turn into an unimaginable nightmare. Out of nowhere, 2 police officers appeared, walking briskly across the park toward her. Their heavy footsteps disturbed the quiet, and the woman looked up, unsure of why they were approaching her. Before she had a chance to even smile or greet them, the officers stopped right in front of her, their faces serious and stern. She had no reason to suspect anything out of the ordinary, until they spoke. "Excuse me, ma'am, but we need to ask you a few questions," one officer said in a harsh tone, his eyes scanning her from head to toe. The woman was taken aback, not understanding why they would want to speak with her. She was simply enjoying the day, not involved in any trouble. Still, she maintained her calm demeanor and set her book aside. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked politely, genuinely confused. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for," the second officer said, his voice cold. "We need to ask you a few questions, and we're going to have to search you." The woman shook her head in disbelief. "I don't know what you're talking about. I've been sitting here reading for the last hour." Before she could say anything more, one of the officers grabbed her by the arm, jerking her up from the bench with surprising force. Startled and frightened, she tried to pull away, but it was no use. The officers were already forcefully guiding her toward the ground. Within moments, she was shoved to the earth, her body crashing against the hard ground, the breath knocked out of her. "Stop resisting!" the first officer shouted, though the woman hadn't resisted at all. She lay there, stunned and helpless, unable to comprehend what was happening. In a split second, the officers slapped handcuffs on her wrists, tightening them so harshly that she winced in pain. She pleaded with them, trying to explain that she hadn't done anything wrong, but her words were drowned out by their commands to stay quiet. She was treated like a criminal, though she had done nothing but enjoy a peaceful afternoon. Tears began to well up in her eyes, a mixture of confusion and fear flooding her mind. She had been the victim of a grave injustice, but no one around seemed to take notice. It was as if her cries for help were ignored by the world around her. Just when it seemed that everything was spiraling out of control and she had lost all hope, something extraordinary happened. A voice rang out from behind the officers, cutting through the chaos like a beacon of light. "Hey, what's going on here?" the voice demanded, firm and authoritative. The officers paused, momentarily distracted by the question. They turned to see who had spoken, and their faces shifted from confidence to surprise as the figure stepped forward. There, standing in the middle of the park, was none other than Mike Tyson, the legendary boxer known for his incredible strength and even greater reputation. His intense gaze and commanding presence immediately drew attention. The officers, clearly caught off guard, hesitated. "Let her go," Mike Tyson commanded, his voice calm but unwavering. "What you're doing is wrong." The elderly woman's eyes widened as she looked up at the man who had just intervened. She couldn't believe her eyes. Tyson, the champion who had battled his way to the top of the boxing world, was now standing up for her. She had never imagined such a thing could happen in her wildest dreams. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of how to respond to the legendary figure standing before them. They tried to justify their actions, but Tyson wasn't having any of it. "I don't care what your reasons are," he said firmly. "This woman is being treated unjustly, and it needs to stop right now." The situation had shifted in an instant. The officers seemed to realize that they were out of their depth. With a few more exchanges, they finally relented, unlocking the handcuffs and stepping away. The elderly woman slowly rose to her feet, her heart still racing from the ordeal, but now with a sense of relief washing over her. Tyson didn't leave after the officers walked away. He stayed by her side, offering a reassuring smile. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. She nodded, still in shock, and thanked him repeatedly. She had never expected such an act of kindness from a stranger, let alone from someone so famous. In that moment, something incredible happened. Courage and compassion had turned the tide against the injustice that had threatened to destroy the peace of her afternoon. Tyson's intervention had not only saved her from further harm, but also restored her faith in the goodness of people, even in the most unexpected of circumstances. What happens next is a story of resilience, courage, and hope. Stay tuned to find out how this remarkable encounter continues to unfold. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel, share where you're watching from in the comments section, and show your support for stories that bring light to the world. Your engagement helps us tell more meaningful and inspiring stories, just like this one. Mike Tyson, the legendary former boxer who once commanded the world's attention with his fierce and unrelenting style in the ring, found solace in the simplicity of Greenwood Park. Every afternoon after his training sessions, Mike would come to this quiet retreat to unwind, away from the noise and pressure that often accompanied his fame. Having lived through a tumultuous past that was filled with highs and lows and a career that thrust him into the global spotlight, he had learned to appreciate these peaceful moments more than anything else. For Mike, the park represented a space where he could shed the burdens of his celebrity status, where the weight of being Iron Mike could be forgotten, even if only for a little while. The park was his sanctuary, his place to be just another person, taking in the beauty of nature, listening to the rustling of leaves, and feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. It was in these moments that Mike felt most at peace, able to balance the chaos of his life and connect with something more grounded. He would often walk along the winding paths, breathing in the fresh air, lost in his thoughts. This afternoon, like so many others, was meant to be a time of reflection and calm. As he strolled down one of the tree-lined paths that meandered beside a serene pond, he noticed how the water shimmered under the soft golden light of the afternoon sun. He paused for a moment, admiring the tranquility of the scene. But the peace didn't last long. Suddenly, a sharp voice broke through the calm atmosphere. The sound was unmistakable. Someone was shouting, their voice rising with agitation. Mike's attention snapped to the source of the commotion. His sharp instincts, honed over years of navigating tense and unpredictable situations in the boxing ring, immediately sensed something was wrong. Without hesitation, he moved toward the sound of the yelling. As he rounded a corner, his gaze fixed on the scene before him. Two police officers, Blake and Carter, were engaged in a heated confrontation with an elderly woman who sat on a stone bench near the pond. The woman appeared frail and small, her thin frame hunched slightly as she nervously glanced between the officers. She was clearly out of her element, bewildered by the situation. Mike could tell she wasn't resisting. In fact, she looked terrified, as though she didn't understand why she was being accosted by these officers. The officers were speaking loudly, their voices filled with authority and impatience. Mike could hear snippets of their conversation as he drew closer. "Ma'am, we've asked you enough questions," Officer Blake was saying in a dismissive tone. "You're making this difficult, and we don't have time for your excuses." The woman, visibly shaken, began to speak, trying to explain herself. "I don't understand. I'm just sitting here, enjoying the park. Please, I don't know what's going on." But before she could finish her sentence, Officer Carter, who was standing on the other side of the bench, grabbed her arm roughly. The action was abrupt, and before anyone could react, he pulled her up from the bench with such force that she lost her balance and tumbled to the ground. The elderly woman cried out in shock, her frail body hitting the hard concrete of the path with a sickening thud. The sound echoed through the park. Mike's heart dropped as he witnessed the scene. His instincts kicked into high gear. In that moment, he couldn't just stand by and watch this injustice unfold. The sight of a woman, vulnerable and powerless, being treated with such disregard triggered something deep within him. He had seen the harsh realities of life, but there was no excusing what he had just witnessed. Without thinking, he rushed toward the officers. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" he shouted, his voice booming across the park. The officers froze for a moment, their attention momentarily diverted to the towering figure who had just entered the scene. Mike Tyson was a name known all over the world, and seeing him in person caused both Blake and Carter to hesitate, their faces shifting from the authority they had been wielding to a palpable unease. Mike's eyes locked onto the officer who had pulled the woman down. He could see the confusion in the officer's eyes as they tried to figure out how to handle the situation now that the legendary boxer was involved. Mike's presence was commanding, and the officers were now aware that they had an audience, and not just any audience, but a figure whose reputation could turn the tide of public opinion with a single word. He crouched down beside the elderly woman, gently helping her to her feet. "Are you okay?" Mike asked softly, his voice surprisingly calm and reassuring in contrast to the chaos that had just erupted. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes, but she didn't speak, clearly still in shock from the ordeal. Mike turned back to the officers, his gaze hardening. "What's going on here? What's the reason you're treating her like this?" Officer Blake opened his mouth, but Mike cut him off. "Don't even try to explain. It's obvious you've got this all wrong." His voice was steady, but the authority in it was unmistakable. "This woman has done nothing wrong. You're out of line." For a long moment, there was silence, and the officers exchanged looks. The tension was thick in the air as Mike continued to stand his ground. He wasn't going to let this injustice go unchallenged. Finally, Officer Carter muttered something under his breath, but he made no move to escalate the situation further. Blake, too, seemed to recognize the gravity of the situation and the consequences that could follow if they didn't back down. With a reluctant nod, Blake released his grip on the woman's arm and stepped back. "Let her go," he said, though the words came out more as a command than an apology. Mike didn't move right away. He made sure the officers understood that what they had done was not acceptable. He stood there for a few more moments, watching the elderly woman carefully, making sure she was okay. Only then did he step back, allowing her some space to regain her composure. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," Mike said softly, looking at the woman with sympathy. "Are you going to be okay?" She nodded slowly, though her hands were still shaking. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mike gave her a reassuring smile, then turned and walked away, his steps slow and deliberate as he disappeared back into the park. But for the elderly woman, and for everyone who had witnessed the encounter, that moment would never be forgotten. As for Mike Tyson, it was another day in the park, but one that would leave an indelible mark on both him and the woman he had so unexpectedly helped. Mike Tyson didn't know who the elderly woman was, but the scene unfolding before him was all too familiar. Her graying hair, frail body, and fearful eyes struck a chord deep within him. He could see the helplessness in her face, the same helplessness he had often felt in his own life when he was looked down upon because of where he came from and the battles he had fought, both inside and outside the ring. The way people often judged him based on his background, his troubled youth, his rough upbringing, made him feel small, powerless, and judged without reason. Seeing this woman just sitting there minding her own business, now being treated with the same kind of disdain and violence he had experienced in his own past, made his blood boil. What angered Mike the most was the sheer disregard the officers had for her humanity. Officer Blake was still roughly handcuffing the woman, his movements harsh and aggressive, as she trembled and tried in vain to explain herself. She wasn't resisting. She wasn't a threat. She was just an elderly woman in a park, trying to enjoy a peaceful afternoon. Yet here she was, being brutalized by the very people who were supposed to protect her. The image of her vulnerability was like a mirror to the powerlessness Mike once felt in his own life, and it stirred something primal within him. A few people in the park had stopped to watch the scene unfold, but no one dared to step forward. Some had taken out their phones, recording what was happening, but they remained on the sidelines, too afraid or indifferent to do anything more. Mike's jaw clenched. This was a moment of injustice, and he couldn't just stand by and watch. He had been through enough in his life to recognize when someone was being wronged. More importantly, he knew the kind of pain that came from being oppressed and mistreated. The emotions that stirred in his chest weren't just anger. They were empathy. This woman wasn't just an anonymous figure in a park. She represented every person who had ever been trampled by the system, by those who held power over others without regard for the truth. And Mike wasn't about to let that happen again, not on his watch. With swift determination, Mike stepped forward, his pace quickening as he closed the distance between himself and the officers. His presence commanded attention, and as he walked, his thoughts became a singular focus. I can't let this continue. Mike wasn't the same man he once was. The wild, reckless energy of his youth had been replaced by something far more focused and resolute. He had seen what unchecked power could do. He had been both the recipient and the wielder of it during his fighting days. But now, he used that strength for a different purpose, to stand up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. As he neared the officers, his eyes that once made even the toughest opponents in the ring tremble in fear, filled with unwavering determination. Blake and Carter had no idea who they were dealing with, and Mike was fine with that. He wanted them to see someone who had been through the fire and came out stronger on the other side. This wasn't about ego. It was about doing what was right. He stopped a few paces away from the officers, taking a moment to observe the situation. His gaze swept over the elderly woman, still trembling on the ground, and then moved to the officers, their postures tense and defensive, unwilling to back down. Mike's voice broke the silence, calm but cutting through the air like a sharp blade. "Hey, what are you guys doing?" he called out, his words heavy with authority. "She's just sitting on a bench. Is this how you enforce justice?" The two officers froze for a moment, turning to look at the intruder who had just addressed them. At first, they didn't recognize him. The annoyance on their faces was evident. They had a job to do, or so they thought, and they didn't appreciate being interrupted. But as the seconds passed and the realization hit them, something shifted. This wasn't just some passerby. This was Mike Tyson. Carter, the younger of the two officers, raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a dismissive smirk. "It's not your business," he snapped, his tone cold and patronizing. "Move aside before you get in trouble." Mike didn't flinch. He stood his ground, unshaken by the officer's command. The words didn't affect him. In fact, they only fueled the fire burning inside him. Mike Tyson wasn't some public figure who could be brushed aside. He wasn't some fame-hungry celebrity. He was someone who had spent years fighting for what was right, inside the ring and in life. "I don't think you understand," Mike said, his voice steady but full of conviction. "She doesn't deserve this treatment. You're hurting her for no reason. I don't care who you are or what your badge says. This is wrong." The officers exchanged a glance, and for a brief moment their confidence wavered. Mike's presence was overwhelming, and the idea of escalating this situation with someone as well known as him didn't seem like the best course of action. But they didn't back down completely, not yet. Blake, the more senior officer, took a step forward, trying to assert control over the situation. "You need to mind your own business," Blake said firmly, trying to reassert his authority. "This is a matter of law enforcement. If you don't want to get involved, I suggest you walk away." Mike's expression hardened and his stance grew more resolute. "I've been involved in a lot of things in my life," he said slowly, his eyes never leaving theirs. "But standing by while someone gets treated like this isn't something I can walk away from." For a moment there was a tense silence. Mike's words had landed, and both officers knew it. The situation was shifting. Mike wasn't going anywhere, and neither were the growing group of people in the park who were watching the exchange unfold. The power dynamics had shifted, and now, for the first time, the officers were questioning whether they had the moral high ground. Mike could feel the heat rising in the air. He wasn't going to let this woman be bullied any longer. This wasn't just about him stepping in, it was about the broader principle of standing up for what was right. In a world where power was often abused, this was his chance to show that courage could make a difference. The officers knew they were at a crossroads. They could keep pushing, but with Mike standing firm and the growing crowd watching, it wouldn't end well for them. Finally, after a few more moments of tense silence, Blake sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly in defeat. "Fine," he muttered, clearly frustrated. "Let her go." Mike nodded slowly, but his eyes never left them. This better be the last time something like this happens today. Mike Tyson took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling slowly as he stood his ground. His fists, clenched but not yet raised, were a physical manifestation of the tension building inside him. His voice, when it came, was calm but firm, carrying with it the weight of his conviction. "This is not how you treat an elderly person," Mike said, his words steady and unwavering. "Especially when she hasn't done anything wrong. Let her go right now." Blake, the more senior of the two officers, smirked, clearly undeterred by Mike's presence. He glanced over at his partner, Carter, who was standing next to him with a look of disdain. "Look," Blake said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "this guy thinks he's a hero. He doesn't even know who this old lady is. He's just playing at being a good Samaritan." Carter's sneer deepened as his eyes flicked over Mike's broad frame, sizing him up like a potential adversary. His tone was venomous. "We're police officers," Carter spat, making sure his badge was visible, as if it were a shield against the world. "We don't need outsiders directing us. If you don't want trouble, you'd better leave." Mike's fists tightened. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, but he knew that responding with anger or aggression would only escalate the situation. He had been in plenty of confrontations throughout his life, some of them in the ring, others in more personal battles. But this moment was different. This wasn't about fighting for his own pride or survival. This was about standing up for someone who had no voice in the face of unjust authority. He forced himself to remain calm, breathing deeply as he locked eyes with the officers. "If I do nothing, who will stand up for her?" That thought echoed in his mind, louder than any words spoken by Blake or Carter. He couldn't just walk away. He couldn't allow this injustice to go unchecked. Mike took another step toward the elderly woman, positioning himself between her and the two officers. His body was a wall of protection, his stature broad enough to shield her from further harm. The elderly woman, still handcuffed and trembling, lifted her gaze to Mike. Her face was haggard, streaked with the faint traces of tears, but there was a glimmer of hope in her eyes as she looked up at him. Mike knelt down beside her, his movements slow and gentle, careful not to intimidate her further. He could see how frightened she was, and his heart ached for her. Leaning in, he asked softly, "Are you okay?" "What did they do to you?" The woman opened her mouth to speak, but before she could get the words out, Officer Carter's voice cut through the air, sharp and challenging. "I already told you, back off!" Carter barked, his eyes narrowing in irritation. "You're obstructing law enforcement." Mike didn't flinch. His eyes were locked on Carter, and he met the officer's challenge with quiet resolve. "Obstructing what?" Mike asked, his voice a low rumble of authority. "You have no legitimate reason to arrest her. You haven't even explained or provided any evidence." His words were firm, the truth behind them undeniable. "I can't stand by and watch you abuse your power like this." For a moment, the park seemed to hold its breath. The scene had escalated to a standoff, and the tension was palpable. Onlookers who had been watching from a distance now stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Some had their phones still raised, recording every second, but no one dared to step forward. Blake, trying to maintain his authority, squared his shoulders and spoke up, his tone defensive. "We don't need you playing the hero. Just stay out of this, Tyson. You don't know what's going on here." Mike's expression remained stoic. He had dealt with people trying to dismiss him his whole life, people who underestimated him because of his background, because of the persona that had been built around his career. But this wasn't about his past or who he used to be. This was about right and wrong. "I know enough," Mike replied, his voice unwavering. "I know what it looks like when someone gets pushed around by people in power just because they can, and I'm not standing by and letting that happen to her." Carter, growing more agitated, took a step forward, his hand hovering near his sidearm as if to remind Mike of the authority he wielded. "You need to step back. I've had enough of this nonsense," he threatened, his tone dripping with contempt. "I'm giving you one last chance to walk away before this gets ugly." Mike's gaze didn't falter and his fists remained at his sides, but they were clenched tightly now. He could feel the tension mounting, the sharp pull of adrenaline in his veins, but he refused to be intimidated. His jaw set in a hard line, and his voice dropped low, filled with warning. "You think this is going to scare me?" he asked, his words calm but lethal. "I've been through worse than you could ever dream of. But that woman over there," Mike pointed to the elderly woman, "she's not the one who's supposed to be afraid." Blake and Carter exchanged a quick look, but neither made a move to advance. The standoff seemed to hang in the air, a tense silence filling the space between them. It was clear to both officers that Mike wasn't going to back down, no matter how much they tried to intimidate him. The elderly woman, still trembling, glanced between Mike and the officers. Her eyes filled with a mix of fear and gratitude. She was clearly shaken by the events, but the presence of Mike, his unwavering strength, his willingness to stand by her, seemed to give her a sense of hope. She had been alone, powerless in the face of unjust authority, but now she wasn't. I don't know what to say," she murmured, her voice small but full of emotion. "Thank you." Mike gave her a small, reassuring smile, though his focus remained on the officers. He wasn't going to let this go. Not now. Not ever. The standoff continued, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just about a confrontation between two officers and a man. It was about power, justice, and the courage to stand up when it seemed like no one else would. And in that moment, Mike Tyson wasn't just a boxer. He was a protector, ready to face whatever came next to ensure that the elderly woman's voice was finally heard. Officer Blake took a step back, clearly uneasy, his eyes darting around as the crowd around them grew larger. The hum of whispers filled the air as more people stopped to watch, many pulling out their phones to capture what was happening. Blake's posture remained rigid, trying to project confidence, but the growing attention was beginning to weigh on him. Despite the eyes on him, he still clung to his arrogance, refusing to back down from the situation. "Listen, big guy," Blake said, his voice tinged with frustration, though it lacked the same certainty it had before. "This isn't your business. If you don't want trouble, you should leave before we have to use force." Mike stood tall, his broad frame unwavering in the face of the officer's threats. His eyes were steady, and his voice deep and decisive as he responded. "I'm not someone you can threaten. I'm here to protect her and stop you from doing wrong. Don't do anything you'll regret." His words were a warning, not just to the officers, but to anyone who might think they could use their power without consequence. Blake, though momentarily thrown off balance by the sheer intensity of Mike's presence, tried to recover, his jaw clenching as he stared back at the former champion. But even as he stood there, his hands still resting near his sidearm, a sense of doubt began to settle over him. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, and it became clear that the tide was turning. People were beginning to question the legitimacy of his actions, and the weight of public scrutiny was something Blake couldn't ignore. A few people in the crowd began to speak up. "This isn't right," one voice called out, the words shaky but filled with conviction. "She hasn't done anything wrong," another person chimed in. "Why are you treating her like this? She's just an old woman." The growing chorus of voices made Blake uncomfortable. The support for Mike was undeniable now, and it was clear that the power balance was shifting. Beat his message. He glanced at Carter, who stood silently by his side, looking unsure of how to proceed. The younger officer's face was taut, his gaze shifting from Mike to the crowd and then back to the elderly woman. In the face of this growing pressure, Blake felt the walls closing in around him. He could no longer rely on his position of authority to intimidate people into submission. The public was watching, and Mike Tyson, an icon, a figure respected by millions, was standing right in front of him, unwavering in his resolve. The elderly woman, still handcuffed but now visibly calmer, shifted her gaze between Mike and the officers. Her expression softened with relief, and for the first time since the confrontation began, she allowed herself to breathe a little easier. She had been afraid, her body trembling, not just from the cold, but from the overwhelming fear of being treated unjustly. But now, with Mike standing there, she felt a sense of security she hadn't had all afternoon. A slow realization seemed to dawn on the officers. Blake's earlier bravado began to fade, and Carter, too, looked like he was reconsidering his position. The crowd's presence, combined with Mike's quiet authority, made it clear that continuing down this path wasn't just dangerous, it was wrong. The tension hung thick in the air as the officers exchanged a quick look, both of them considering their options. After a long, charged silence, Blake finally let out a heavy sigh, his shoulders slumping slightly as the fight left him. He knew this wasn't a battle he was going to win. Not today, not with so many eyes watching, and certainly not when Mike Tyson, a man with a history of standing up for what was right, was standing in his way. Blake lowered his hands and took a step back, a reluctant gesture of surrender. "Fine," he muttered, his voice strained. "Let her go." Mike didn't immediately respond. He simply stood there, his gaze unwavering, watching as Blake hesitated before reaching for the cuffs on the elderly woman's wrists. There was no triumphant smile on Mike's face. This wasn't about winning a fight. It was about ensuring that justice, however small the victory, was served. As Blake unlocked the cuffs and allowed the elderly woman to stand, the crowd exhaled in relief. A few people clapped, others murmured words of encouragement. Mike turned to the woman, offering a small, reassuring smile. "You're free now," he said softly. The elderly woman blinked up at him, still in shock but overwhelmed with gratitude. I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "Thank you." Mike nodded, his expression warm but serious. "Just make sure this doesn't happen again," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "No one should ever be treated like that." As the crowd slowly began to disperse, the tension of the moment began to dissolve. The officers stood in silence, a mix of frustration and defeat etched on their faces. For them, this wasn't just an encounter with a celebrity. It was a reminder of the power of standing up for what's right, even in the face of authority. And as they watched Mike Tyson turn away, leaving the park with his head held high, they couldn't help but feel the sting of a lesson learned the hard way. Mike's steps were slow but purposeful as he walked away from the scene, the crowd now scattered and murmuring, with some still talking excitedly about what had just unfolded. The elderly woman, her hands no longer bound, slowly made her way toward the park's exit, a slight, grateful smile still on her lips. As for Mike, he had done what he set out to do. He had stepped in, not because of his fame, but because it was the right thing to do. And in that moment, he had shown everyone around him that sometimes the most important thing you can do is to stand up when no one else will. If you were moved by this powerful moment of courage, justice, and humanity, be sure to like this video and share it with those who need to hear this story. Sometimes the smallest act of standing up for someone can have the biggest impact. Leave a comment below telling us what you think about what Mike Tyson did today. Let's continue to spread messages of kindness and strength in the face of adversity. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories of everyday heroes and moments that remind us all to stand up for what's right. Thanks for watching, and remember, when you see injustice, don't walk away. Stand up.